What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. I hope you guys have been staying safe and you've been doing well since the last time I posted. Today we're talking about the murder of 4-year-old Derek Robie, who on August 2nd, 1993 was murdered in his hometown of Savona, New York by another kid, 13-year-old Eric Smith. Now, some of you, after just saying that little bit, already know this case because at the time this case happened, there was plenty of media attention around it, and the media circus that follows cases latched onto this case for a number of reasons. So some of you already know this case, and some of you probably don't, which just happens with cases like this. But without any further ado, let's get into this story, shall we? But before I talk about the case specifically, I want to tell you a little bit about 4-year-old Derek Robie, who was just this outgoing, loving 4-year-old boy. Now, Derek, like I just said, was 4 years old when he was tragically and brutally murdered by 13-year-old Eric Smith, who was 13 years old at the time of the crime. He's not still 13 years old all these years later. But he was just your typical kid. He was an outgoing, fun-loving kid. He played on his t-ball team. He went fishing with his dad. He was a good older brother to his 2-year-old younger brother who was home with him that day. He was just your typical normal 4-year-old boy who had a love in his zest for life that every 4-year-old boy and girl should have. They shouldn't be worried about getting murdered by slightly older children. They should just be worried about not wanting to eat their vegetables at dinner and whatever else 4-year-olds worry about. But that morning, it was just a typical morning for him. He was getting ready to go to the summer program at his local park that he loved attending. But he was home with his mom, and he was home with his younger brother, who was, like I said, 2 years old at the time. And Derek was excited, but they were running late because his younger brother was getting fussy. And, 2-year-olds just get fussy. It just happens all the time. But Derek didn't want to be late to the summer program because he absolutely loved going to it. So at some point that morning, he goes to his mother. He goes, "Mom, can I walk to the park by myself?" Now, at 4 years old, Derek had never been anywhere by himself. But his mother eventually thought, you know what? It's about just over a block away. He doesn't even have to cross the street. We live in a very small town. He knows the way because he's been there countless times. So I know that he knows how to get there and back. Sure, honey, you can walk by yourself. Just go straight to the park. Don't stop. Just go there and come back. I love you. I'll see you later, sort of thing. You know what I mean? So she hands him his lunch, kisses him and says, "I love you." Then he says, "I love you too, Mom." And he happily goes bounding out the house, down the street toward the park to have his day at the park like he did every other day. Now, I can imagine in the moment before this crime happened, Derek Robie was really just excited and happy to be going to the park, and his mom trusted him that he was a big boy, that he could do something on his own. But unfortunately for Derek, he wasn't alone that morning on that street. 13-year-old Eric Smith was riding his bike down that street. He saw Derek Robie alone on McCoy Street walking to the park, lunch in hand, and knew that he wanted to take that kid somewhere to hurt him. And he did. So he stops Derek Robie and offers him a shortcut through the woods to the park. Now, Derek initially says, "No, I'm not supposed to. I'm just going to keep going this way." But instead of getting on his bike and riding off into the sunset, Eric repeatedly coaxes him into the woods by saying, "It's all right, I'm right here." Now, eventually, Derek relents. He's like, "Okay, I'll follow you through the woods. We'll get to the park quicker. It'll be fine." You know what I mean? So Eric leads Derek through the woods. Now, at some point, once they reach like a little overgrown section of the woods, Derek gets in front of Eric. Eric puts his bike down, walks up behind 4-year-old Derek, puts his arm around his neck, and begins strangling him. Now, at this point, Derek drops his lunch. He starts flailing his arms, flailing his legs in a desperate attempt to escape Eric Smith's clutches. Now, Eric Smith readjusts his grip, so he's not strangling him with just his arm anymore. He's got both of his hands wrapped around Derek's neck. And about 30 or so seconds later, Eric's not gasping for air anymore. He's not fighting, his arms aren't swinging, and his legs aren't swinging anymore. So Eric assumes that Derek is dead, so he drops him to the ground. But Derek's not dead yet. He's still fighting for his life. He does not want to die here in these woods the first time he ever left home by himself. He doesn't, no one wants to be murdered like this. But he starts gasping for air. So Eric Smith turns to Derek Robie's lunch bag that his mom lovingly packed for him, dumps the contents out onto the ground, grabs a paper napkin, starts shoving it into Derek's mouth, turns back to the pile of lunch, grabs a sandwich bag, and attempts to shove that into Derek Robie's mouth as well. But Derek, still desperately fighting for his life, bites down on Eric's fingers that were in his mouth as he was shoving this into his mouth. Now, it didn't take his finger off or anything, but he bit him hard enough that Eric cried out in pain. So he gets his finger out of his mouth, then he kneels over 4-year-old Derek Robie's body, picks up a rock, starts hitting him with it multiple times in the head. Then he does that 2 more times. He picks up another large rock with both hands, hits him with it. Then he picks up a 3rd rock, hits him in the chest, and hits him in the midsection with it. Then Eric Smith stands up, grabs the thermos of Kool-Aid that his mother packed for him, opens it. I read in several sources that he took a sip of it. Some places say he didn't. Then he pours it on the Derek Robie's face. Now, you would think that he's done here. You know, he's committed the act he wants to commit. He's going to go off and do whatever the hell else he wants to do. But Eric Smith isn't done yet. He pulls down 4-year-old Derek Robie's pants, turns him over so he's on his stomach. And this is really hard to say, but this is a big part of the case, so we have to say this. He sodomizes him with a tree branch. He flips him back over, pants still around his ankles, and drags him a few feet over to what was described as like a rock pile, like a rock cropping. He leaves him there. And he poses his body, investigators say. And we know that he most likely posed his body because he takes his shoes off and puts them by the opposite hands. So his left shoe is by his right hand, his right shoe is by his left hand. He leaves, but he comes back most likely at least 2 times. I say he came back 2 times because he said he wanted to double and triple check that that Derek was dead. So I say, hey, if he wanted to triple check, he probably came back twice, because time 1 is the initial crime, time 2 is the first time he revisits, then time 3 is the second revisit. But he wants to revisit this body for multiple reasons. 1, he got enjoyment, he got an immense enjoyment out of killing this kid. And 2, he wants to make sure Derek's dead so he can't tell on him. So, but eventually, Eric Smith gets onto his bike, rides off into the day to do whatever the heck else he was planning on doing that day. Now, a couple hours later at about 11 a.m., because this is still like a little after 9 o'clock in the morning, it starts to rain. And Derek's mother knows that when it rains, the park cancels the rest of the activities they have for the day. And then they say, hey, we'll see you guys tomorrow. Have a good day. Come back tomorrow when it's not raining. But Derek doesn't come home, and she is instantly worried, like any good mother would. So she races off to the park, talks to the volunteers, and quickly realizes that Derek never showed up to the park that day. He never got there. The volunteers who know Derek never saw him. So she instantly calls the police. Now, I just want to take a second here, and I really want to commend the police for this investigation, but because we've seen all too often in high-profile cases like this, where the police bungle the investigation, the police handle it awfully, but that's not how this went down. The police really handled this case as perfectly as you can handle something awful like this to get justice for Derek Robie's family. So I just want to commend the police for doing their jobs on this case and not letting a killer go free to eventually to maybe kill again. So I just wanted to say that. So Derek's mother reports him missing, and they immediately launch a massive search for him, like anyone would for a missing 4-year-old. And they're thinking maybe he ran off, maybe he got distracted by like a bird or a buddy of his that he saw, who knows where Derrick might be. But they find his body about almost 4 o'clock that same afternoon. They find his body right where Eric Smith left him, beaten, bruised, Kool-Aid dumped on his face, the tree branch, the whole 9 yards. Exactly how his body was left by Eric Smith is how they find his body. And this sends this community in the shockwaves, because Savona, New York was, a lot of people described it to be like Mayberry. It was small town USA, where if you wanted to get away from the hustle and the bustle of the big city, this was the perfect place to just slow down and raise your family. So crimes like this don't happen in Mayberry. Crimes like this don't happen in small town USA. They happen in the big cities like New York and Chicago and LA, the glitz and the glamour of the city. This doesn't happen in Savona, New York, but it has. And so the police immediately launch a massive investigation to find out who in the world would want to hurt an innocent 4-year-old boy. Now, the entire time, basically up until the point Eric Smith confesses, it is not on police's radar that a kid could have been involved in this at all. They're thinking maybe it was an adult that happened to be traveling through town that just so happened to see Eric walking on his own and took the opportunity. Maybe it was someone on the local sex offender registry. We don't know. They're just not thinking that it was a 13-year-old boy that committed this crime. That's just not on their radar, because why would it be? Why would it be on anyone's radar to see like a 4-year-old victim and think, yes, that 13-year-old boy over there did it? It wasn't. But they start their investigation, and they try to talk to literally almost everyone in this town. This town's probably got 900 or so people, and they interviewed north of 500 people during the course of this investigation. And they eventually get to Eric Smith. Now, Eric Smith they had already seen earlier, because they saw him at the police barricade. You know how when like police show up to a crime scene and they like barricade it off and tape it off? He was one of the first people there watching the police work, like removing Derrick's body, collecting evidence, all that stuff that the police do at crime scenes. He was there at the crime scene, but they don't talk to him until like August 5th, so a couple days later. And they talk to him because his mother brings him into the command post because she thinks that he might have some good information to tell the police. But he initially denies seeing Derrick at all. He goes, yeah, I was in and out of the park that morning 3-4 times. I didn't see Derrick. But a couple hours later, they actually go back to Eric Smith's house to talk to him again, because they realize Eric Smith's statement isn't exactly lining up with what the other witnesses have said here. And they're thinking, hey, maybe he saw something and he's too afraid to admit it. Maybe he saw the adult that did this, and maybe that adult even threatened him with violence himself or against his family. It is not on their radar that this kid did this. I can't stress that enough. It's not on their radar that a kid is capable of such brutality. So they go to his home. They start talking to him. Now, this is the first time he admits to seeing Derrick that morning. He goes, yeah, I was riding on this side. I saw Derrick over here. But he describes Derrick's clothing and his lunch bag in such detail that causes the police to do like an impromptu vision test right there as they're talking to him, because they want to see if his eyes are actually that good. But he couldn't, because his glasses had broken a few weeks beforehand and they hadn't been fixed yet. So he couldn't really pass the eye test that the police gave him. And at some point, right after this, Eric Smith like drops his head and he raises his arms and he starts shaking them like this, police said. And then he goes, you think I killed them, don't you? And they go, no. And he goes, I'm not the type of person that would hurt, kill, or sexually molest anyone. So Eric's great-grandfather at this point steps in and ends the investigation. His great-grandfather, or some places call him his grandfather. I am a bit confused in that relationship, because multiple sources call him different things as far as their relationship. So maybe he was his grandfather or his great-grandfather. I've seen multiple places call this guy both of them, so I'm not quite sure on that one. I just couldn't find an actual thing of what he was. I don't know why. But he asked police to leave. So that they leave, and they come back like an hour or so later with the DA to ask the family if they can continue talking to him. So they continue talking to Derrick. He's still not giving them straight answers, but they convince the family to let them bring Derrick back to McCoy Street to do a reenactment of what Derrick's movements were and what he saw that morning and all that stuff. But Derrick couldn't see well. He couldn't see the investigator that was playing Derek Robie. He couldn't describe what he was wearing. But they all said, hey, it's getting late. Let's come back in the morning when it's light outside. Maybe it'll be better. But it's the same thing the next day. He's being cagey with his answers. He's not giving them a straight story. And they're starting to think maybe he didn't even say Derek at all. Maybe he's just so afraid of what he saw that he's not going to say anything to us. So eventually, they do the reenactment. They keep talking to him. They eventually leave. Now, the next day, they don't see him at all. They don't see him again until I think it was August 8th. Now, August 8th is the date that Derrick confesses to his family that he killed Derek Robie. Now, his grandfather, that retired officer that took on the role of his protector, is the one that calls police to basically say, hey, Derrick confessed. He wants to come. We want to bring him to come in to talk to you guys. Now, the entire time of this confession, he's trying to get them to not involve the state police, trying to get them not to arrest Derrick, not to perp walk him, not to indict him. But the police handled this a lot better than I would have, because I would have been like, are you freaking kidding me? I got a dead 4-year-old, and if this kid did it, like you just said that he did, I'm gonna get him. Now, the police didn't exactly word it like that, but they obviously weren't gonna not involve the state police, not interrogate him. But at the outset of this investigation, Derrick's stepfather and this grandfather were both in the room with him. Now, they step by step explain to him his Miranda rights, his right to a lawyer. They break it down for him. And at no point, no adult member of Derrick's family, or even Derrick himself, ever asked for a lawyer, ever asked for clarification on any of his rights. The only thing that Derrick asked about his Miranda rights were a definition of like what an attorney or a lawyer was, because that word confused them. So they said, hey, this is what it is, and they went on with it. Derrick would go on to confess for 3 hours and go into incredibly great detail of what he did that morning and what he did to poor 4-year-old Derek Robie. Now, police would say the entire time they talked to him, from the interviews at his house to this confession that he made, he was thoroughly enjoying being the center of attention, and he even more enjoyed the fact that he was getting to relive what he did to Derek. So he gets arrested after this, and then he gets indicted on, I believe, September 2nd. So he gets arrested on August 10th. He gets indicted on the 2nd, excuse me. His plea hearing is the 10th, in which he pleads not guilty. Now, they're going with an insanity defense here, and the prosecution sniffed that out a mile away. They understood that this was basically the only defense that they could have gone with, so that's what they ended up going with. Now, the defense up until the trial, because the trial doesn't take place until August of 1994, they try everything. They tried to get the case moved from criminal court to family court. They tried to get his confession tossed out. Everything, all these motions that the defense is trying get denied by the courts. They even tried to say he was incompetent to stand trial, and they had a competency hearing, and they basically said, hey, he's competent to stand trial. He's going to have to answer for what he did. So fast forward to August of 94. I tried, like I said before on this channel, I tried not to be critical of defense attorneys because they're just doing their job and defending their clients. But I'm going to be critical of this attorney here, because this attorney, in my opinion, not only does an awful job of defending Derrick because he just didn't have much to work with. I just think he was an awful attorney because he's making things up, and he's doing things, and he does what I call the splitter technique. And I don't know if there's an actual name for it, but this is what I call it. He takes all the things he can puts it in his hand, throws it at the jury box, and hopes that some of it will stick to get Eric a not guilty by reason of insanity verdict. I mean, they try to blame his developmental delays on some anti-seizure medication that his mother was taking while she was pregnant for him. They try to blame bullying, but there's no evidence to support any of this. There's no evidence to support the bullying. There's no evidence to support their claim that this medicine that his mother took did anything to him. Although there is evidence to support the fact that that could have damaged kids, but there's no evidence to support the statement that this particular medicine that his mother took affected him in any way, positively or negatively. Although that medication that she was taking can affect you, there's no evidence that it affected Eric, is what I'm trying to say. They bring on this expert who's just a quack, who just bases his opinion and his statements not on examining Eric's test background and medical history. He just does it based on some assumptions he made on Eric's background, and he diagnoses him with intermittent explosive disorder and tries to say he also has low-grade depression. But the prosecution absolutely tears down this expert and the defense's the defense's case. Now, this expert would later admit on cross-examination that had Eric wanted to, he could have controlled his anger if other people were around. They admitted he was sadistic, and the prosecution expert actually did an incredible job of going through Eric's medical history, going through all that stuff that you have to go through to make a diagnosis. She said, look, there's no history of anger, there's no mental health history with Eric. There's none of this that would point to Eric being mentally ill to the point where he can't understand the wrongfulness and the criminality of his actions. It's just not there. The only thing that she says is maybe Eric has ADHD, but that's about it. Now, the entire time this trial is going on, every time we see Eric in the courtroom, he does not care. You can see him just leaning back, picking at his fingernails, messing with things on the desk. He could not care at all that this trial is going on. Even when the prosecutor is standing up there saying, this boy killed him, he doesn't react. The only time he ever reacts, and this is a bit of a spoiler alert here for those of you that don't know the case, is after he gets convicted of the crime. He has a shocked face in the car as they're leading him out to the car after the conviction, because it just looks that he's thinking, I can't believe they actually convicted me. That's the only time, in my opinion, he ever shows any emotion. Now, he tries to say he's sorry, but I don't believe a word that's ever come out of Eric Smith's mouth, and neither, I think, does most of the village of Savona. I mean, this expert, going back to this defense expert, even tried to get Eric to admit that his own father had been assaulting him, but Eric to this day has repeatedly denied that his father ever touched him inappropriately. They used physical punishment on their children, but there's no evidence to support the statement that Eric Smith was ever wrongfully abused by his parents in any way. But this was the only crime in New York State at the time that Eric Smith could be tried as an adult for. And he was tried as an adult, and he was convicted. He was sentenced to 9 to life, which is the maximum sentence for the crime at his age that he could have been convicted for. Now, at the time, Derek Robie's family was happy because they were obviously just focused on the life side of that sentence. It took them a few years to realize, hey, Eric is going to come up for parole eventually, and we do not want our son's killer back out on the streets. And I totally understand why they feel that way, and I totally agree with them. But throughout his parole hearings, which happen every 2 years, he gets rejected for parole 10 different times. And the parole board basically says the entire time that, hey, he's still a danger to society. He admitted to us and in interviews that he enjoyed the feeling that he got when he was hurting Derek. And had he not been caught, he would have probably kept killing people. How you get away with saying that and eventually getting out is beyond me. But the only thing I can think of is all of those 28 years that he spent in prison. He just spent that time refining his message to the public, saying, hey, I'm not the person I used to be. This isn't who I am anymore. And I read the entire transcript of the parole hearing that he eventually got out after. And this parole hearing, in my opinion, which is about 30 pages long, and you can go online and find it yourself, although there are bits of it that are redacted, is a complete crock. Because in my opinion, based on how these people are talking to Eric and what he says, they already made up their minds beforehand that they wanted to release him. I mean, they talk about his good disciplinary record, the fact that he hadn't really gotten into much trouble in prison, which is good. He was pursuing some educational goals. Initially he said he wanted to move back to Savona with his mother before he can figure out what he wanted to do with his life. But during the whole of this parole hearing, he starts talking about God and says he's a Christian and says he wants to be a crusade evangelist, which is some of the wildest things I've ever heard. I mean, there's a lot of problems with the modern day church in America, but that's a whole separate video. But I would like to think that no church in America would give a convicted killer of a 4-year-old the chance to be a crusade evangelist for their organization or for their church. That's just me. I know if I was a church and I was looking for someone to help spread my message, I'm not taking Eric Smith. He even says he's married, or he says he's engaged to be married, but I don't even believe that because he never says her name. We never see a picture of them together. He says she was a lawyer that initially wrote him about the criminal justice system, and then they just fell in love through there. But they eventually release him, and eventually they find housing for him. But initially they were like, hey, we don't have housing for him because no one wants him. The town of Savona was like, don't bring that a-hole back here. Don't bring him back here. So they're running around for a few months trying to find approved housing for him. And he eventually gets housed in Queens, New York. So if any of you are living in New York City right now, Eric Smith is down there living in Queens. So just be careful. Because I think Eric Smith to this day is still a violent, dangerous person who will, at the first opportunity to, without thinking he's going to get caught, will kill again. And that's the case of 4-year-old Derek Robie and the murder of 13-year-old Eric Smith. Sorry that at this point that this video sounded a little bit rambly at points, but I can be honest with you guys. The first time I read through this case and was looking to see whether or not I wanted to talk about it, my eyes started to water. I don't have any shame in telling you guys that. My eyes started to water just hearing about the sadistic things that Eric Smith put this boy through, and the fact that he is now back out on the streets, I think is completely disgusting, and I think is the exact opposite choice of what they should have done. Now, I am not anti-parole for different crimes. If you've done your time and you've served your sentence, you can get out and go about your life. But I think in this case, this parole board made the entirely wrong decision here. And no case that I've started to look at since I started this channel has affected me as much as this case has affected me. And my heart breaks for the Robie family. I can't even begin to imagine all of the pain and the hurt and the heartache that they've experienced over the years. And now that he's out, it's really done. There's really nothing that they can do about it. But everyone's just trying to get on with their lives. Now, I hope I'm wrong about this. I hope that I'm wrong about the fact that Eric Smith is just this violent, cold-blooded murderer who, at the first opportunity, will hurt someone again. I really hope I can come back on here in 20, 30 years and be like, hey, remember that case I talked about, Eric Smith? I was wrong. He hasn't hurt anybody. My bad, buddy. But I don't think I'm wrong about this. And I don't think I'm going to have to do that video. But yeah, let me know in the comments below what you think about this video, what you think about the parole of Eric Smith. Should he have gotten out? Should he not have? Let me know what other cases you might want to see me cover, and I just might do them. And until then, guys, have fun and stay safe.